Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. My first question, though, is I'm really surprised to see you all here. When I first talked to Joe Bast, I said, Joe, 5 p.m. after a full day? And he said, no, that's a prime time. And I said, yeah, there'll probably be about 20 people here. And so he was right and I was wrong. I have a hypothesis for why you're all here, and it's that I didn't know that Texas had licensing hours for bars and pubs, and they're all closed from 3 to 6. But thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Heartland Institute for inviting me. I've worked with Sterling and Heartland and many of the people at Heartland for a long time, long before I joined CEI. And I just want to say it's an indispensable group. You know, Sterling mentioned that I chair this nonprofit coalition called the Cooler Heads Coalition, and the Heartland Institute plays an indispensable role in the effort over the years to stop Kyoto, to defeat cap and trade, and now to, for example, get us out of the Paris Climate Treaty. And I want to mention Joe and Diane Bass, because I think, you know, Joe said he's retiring. I find that a little hard to believe, but Joe and Diane have worked like slaves for decades for the cause of freedom, limited government, and sensible policies. And we just owe them a whole lot, so I just want to really please convey, because you'll probably have a big party in Chicago, but I won't be able to come to it. Now, I suffered information overload. What?
We call it a wake.
A wake, yeah. Well, you have a great new president, so I've known Tim when he was in Congress. Now, I suffered information overload about 11:30 this morning, and I've been trying to get over it ever since, so I'm going to be a little bit lighter than Steve and Dave here. Yesterday, at the meeting we had here, we celebrated the fact that 1 year ago today, President Trump was elected. And for those of us who were on the transition team, it turned out that we woke up 1 year ago today, and the work we'd done for the last 2 months wasn't just an exercise, that it was actually going to have consequences. So I just want to say where I think the Trump agenda is coming from and how environmental policies and reforms play into that, and energy as well. So I'm going to... President Trump, like the other Republican candidates, ran on a platform of economic growth. Now, here's the problem. For well over 100 years, the U.S., even through recessions, had 3% per annum economic growth until 2008, and I want to show you a detail of that. Our economy is now more than 12% below where it should be if we'd had 3% economic growth, which we haven't had for 15 years. And in fact, all of the defenders of the Democrats in power, like Paul Krugman and all the other academic economists, said, oh, the economy has changed. We'll never get back to 3% economic growth. President Trump ran a rather unusual campaign. He didn't have a set of talking points from last night's polls. He had these big rallies. I wasn't a Trump supporter. I didn't go to any of these rallies. But I found out once I started working for the transition that he was a very unusual candidate. He wasn't just a showman. He didn't just go to these huge rallies. He stayed for hours and hours afterwards talking to people. And he discovered something. He discovered that the heartland of America, where people dig up stuff, make stuff, and grow stuff for a living and don't manipulate financial information or electrons in a computer, that those people had had economic stagnation for 2 decades. And it was a result of government policies. It was a result of regulation and taxation and some other things. So my colleague Wayne Cruz, this is something that in 2011, Darrell Issa at the House Oversight Committee asked hundreds of companies and groups like Heartland and CEI What is the major obstacle to doing business in your part of the world? Half the several hundred responses said the Environmental Protection Agency, and about 15% more said Fish and Wildlife, said DOE, the Endangered Species Act, things like that. Well, that was 2011. That was before the Obama regulatory avalanche occurred. So my colleague Wayne Cruz does an annual snapshot of the regulatory state called 10,000 Commandments, and he tots up all of the costs of regulation. These are just the identified costs. Currently, they're about $1.9 trillion in a $17 or $18 trillion economy, and the key point is these are the costs of existing business. These are not the opportunity costs of people who don't make investments and start new businesses and create jobs because of the current regulatory structure and tax structure and all of the obstacles the government puts up to economic activity. I don't think President Trump ever saw that graph, but he got it. He said we are going to get back to 3% economic growth because we are going to unleash investment in the resource and manufacturing economies. And we're going to start with energy, and we're going to start with EPA regulations. So he didn't have a policy apparatus in his campaign. You know, most presidential campaigns, Senate campaigns, they have a bunch of policy papers, and they're 20, 30 pages long, and they lay out the agenda, and they fudge every issue. They don't make any promises. President Trump, during the campaign, didn't have a policy shop, really, until May of 2016, and it was just a few people. He started giving speeches. The first speech he gave was in Bismarck, North Dakota on May 26, 2016, and he laid out his agenda for energy and environmental reform. Now, what is the goal of all of the Obama regulations created over the last 5 or 6 years? Organize the entire U.S. and global economies around programs to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. That is, around reducing use of coal, oil, and natural gas, and turn robust economies based on producing and using abundant energy into economies based on using much less. That is, turning Texas into California. That is the goal of the Obama administration and the Democrats in Congress. It's to make everything look like John Piscopo, make it look like Connecticut. A lovely state being ruined by the political majority that it has driven the economy into bankruptcy. So President Trump said, I'm going to do some things. He made 42 or 43 promises on energy and environment. 15 of them applied to the EPA. So the goal of the transition, and now the goal of the administrator and his team, Scott Pruitt at EPA, is to implement those promises. And as people have said, Scott Pruitt is making a great start on that. The president is making a great start. Steve misspoke. He said that President Trump said he'd leave a little bit of the EPA. He actually said, I want to abolish the EPA. We may leave a little bit. I'm with the abolish side, but we'll go on to that. So what is the goal of the Trump deregulatory policies? If you can't read the caption, it's "We'll always have Pittsburgh." Well, with President Obama's policies, we weren't going to have Pittsburgh. Remember, Detroit in 1960 was one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Now large parts of it are farmland. Chicago is about 20 years away from heading down to where Detroit is now. So we won't always have Pittsburgh if we commit to policies that are based on the Paris agenda, the Paris Climate Treaty. President Trump actually wants Pittsburgh to remain Pittsburgh. So what we now face, and I would say this is a problem, Scott Pruitt can do a lot of things, and Steve mentioned the science advisory boards and so on. We have to codify as many of these things into law as possible, or else they will be undone by a future administration, either Democrat or typical Bush establishment Republican. That's not going to be easy because the Senate no longer is functional. So I have some thoughts on that, but I don't have time to give them to you today. Maybe you'll ask a question. What do we do about the Senate besides abolishing it? But I want to say this is a moment where the path we were going down was going to turn all of the United States into a model of the California economy, where people who are in Silicon Valley or Hollywood or have big public pensions do fine, but people in the Central Valley are reduced to third world status. That's the path we were going down. President Trump has now allowed the states that don't want to go down that path to revive economically and to let freedom out again. And if California and Connecticut and Illinois and New York want to keep going down that path, then under our system, they have every right to do so. And let's see how it turns out. That's what an experiment in federalism is all about. So I think we have reached a tremendous turning point in the history of this country on environmental policy. I think, it's great to talk all day about producing more energy, but the problem is, under the current regime, until President Trump and Scott Pruitt dismantle it, you can't use that energy. So this is a great moment. Everybody should savor it and keep pushing. We need to support everything that the Trump administration is doing that's moving towards less regulation and more freedom. And we need to oppose them when they start going bad, when the swamp starts taking over, which is, I'm sure some of you are aware, President Trump has allowed some parts of the swamp already to invade parts of his administration, not the EPA, but some other places. So there's a lot of work still to do. I think one of the problems that Republicans have, or conservatives, is that once their guys get into office, they say all the work is done, we can relax. The environmental movement doesn't do that. The environmental movement will get 95% of what they want from an administration, and they'll complain and say we're being sold out because we didn't get 100%. We say we get 50% of what we want, and we say thank you. We shouldn't do that. Now, the other problem is the correlation of forces is still against us. I mentioned this last night. The top 10 environmental groups have a budget of over $1 billion a year. The top 50 environmental groups have a budget of over $3 billion a year. CEI has a budget of $8 million. Jay, what's Heartland?
7.5.
So, well, yeah, we're the same size. We're the two biggest groups working on these issues from a free market perspective. So you see what we're up against and why we can't relax. And with that, thank you very much.